Long before airplanes flew across the sky or huge cruise ships floated on the ocean, the cold and stormy seas of the North Atlantic were ruled by the toughest explorers in history, known as the Vikings, who were not men who sat around looking at maps because they didn't really have any, but instead they trusted the stars, the birds, and their own bravery to guide their wooden longships through crashing waves and freezing winds. About 1,000 years ago, way back in the year 1000, the world was a very different place, where most people in Europe thought the ocean just went on forever until you fell off the edge. But the Vikings were different, because they had a fearless hunger to see what lay beyond the thick mist. It all started with a man named Eric the Red, who was a very grumpy Viking with a bright red beard and a bad temper that got him banished from his home in Iceland. So he sailed west and found a giant frozen island that he cleverly named Greenland just to trick people into moving there. But his son, Leif Erikson, was not just strong like his father, he was also curious and smart, and his eyes were fixed on a mysterious story told by a merchant who had gotten lost in a storm and seen a dark coast far to the west, but never stopped to touch the ground. Leif could not stop thinking about this unknown land, so he decided to do what no one else dared to do. He bought that merchant's old boat, gathered a crew of 35 fearless sailors, and set off into the unknown, dangerous waters without a compass or a GPS, guided only by the sun and the stories of old sailors. For days and nights, their open wooden boat with a carved dragon head on the front was tossed around like a toy by the giant Atlantic waves, and the freezing, salty spray soaked them to the bone. But Leif stood tall at the front of the ship, straining his eyes against the gray horizon until finally they saw it. Not ice, not snow, but actual solid land. First, they found a place full of flat rocks, which Leif called Helluland, but it was boring and cold, so they kept going. And then they found a land full of thick white forests, which he called Markland, but Leif wanted something better, so they sailed south for 2 more days until they found the most beautiful place they had ever seen, where the grass was green, the rivers were full of giant salmon, and the air was warmer than freezing Greenland. The biggest surprise came when one of Leif's crew members, a man who had known grapes back in Germany, went exploring and came back running with his hands full of wild berries and grapes, which was amazing because Vikings loved sweet fruit and wine. So Leif happily named this new world Vinland, which means wineland. They jumped off their ships and started building sod houses with grass roofs to stay for the winter, making them the very first Europeans to build a home in North America, exactly 500 years before Christopher Columbus was even born. They spent the winter there, enjoying the mild weather compared to their icy homes, and cutting down strong timber to take back to Greenland, where trees were scarce. But their adventure wasn't just a peaceful holiday, because they soon realized they were not alone in this new world. There were already people living in this land, native tribes who the Vikings called Skrellings, and although they traded a little bit at first, fear and language barriers led to fights and skirmishes that made the Vikings realize that keeping a tiny village so far away from their main army was just too dangerous. Eventually, Leif and his crew loaded their ship with dried grapes and precious wood and sailed back to Greenland as heroes who had touched the edge of the world, leaving behind their houses, which slowly disappeared into the earth and became overgrown with grass. For centuries, people thought the story of Leif Erikson was just a made-up fairy tale told around campfires to scare children or brag about Viking strength. But in the 1960s, archaeologists in Newfoundland, Canada, dug up the ground and found the remains of Viking houses, iron nails, and pins, proving once and for all that the brave Leif Erikson was the true discoverer of the New World, and that the Vikings had walked on American soil while the rest of Europe was still asleep.